Welcome to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton. He's locked, loaded, and ready to fire. Lawton Online starts right now.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Lawton Online here on the Rebel.media. My name's Andrew Lawton, and it is so great to have you tuned into the program, as always, I hope. It is for me, anyway. This week's episode of the show coming a little bit late here. I think we're 24 hours late. I was actually in Alberta for a few days visiting some family and doing some work, and I couldn't lug all of my recording equipment out there. But don't worry, we'll be back and better than ever. I'll have to talk to you a little bit about my Alberta adventure next week on the show. Oh my goodness. Things are rebounding, though. People are starting to realize just how dangerous their new government is, the socialist paradise that is Alberta. I am going to be joined later on in the show by fellow Rebel Faith Goldy, however, talking about something that really follows up nicely to last week's show about refugees and the sex assaults in Europe. She's talking about the remedy for that. And I'll assure you, men, it starts with us. That's coming up later on in the show. And I'm also going to be chatting with National Post columnist Barbara Kay about Raheel Raza and, more importantly, in a broader context, what Raza's work represents. Barb Kay had a great piece about this where she really broke down the need to have people within Islam criticizing the radical part of that religion and those who embrace it. So we'll be talking about that later on in the show as well. But I wanted to start off by really giving you a couple of examples of some PC insanity here. Now, you could arguably say that PC is synonymous with insanity. I've often characterized the cult of political correctness as essentially being PC doctrine, because that's what it is. It's become a religion. It's the closest thing we have in Canada to a state religion, apart from, well, recycling, I think, is also one of the contenders on that list. And we have in Canada, in some ways, a codification of political correctness. Except it's not called that. It's called human rights law. We see it at the federal level. We see it at the provincial level, even though we did have a victory in this country a couple of years ago when Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act was stricken. This was the provision that was used to go after people like Kathy Shadle, people like Ezra Levant, etc. This was the section that Richard Warman was so famous for utilizing, going after people like Connie Fournier of Free Dominion and Mark Fournier as well. And it's something that was ultimately a censorship provision in human rights law. But at the provincial level, we see it as well, not with directly impacting free speech like Section 13 did, but by creating these special victim groups, creating these grievance groups that apparently are supposed to be free of discrimination. The problem is the bar for discrimination has been set so low right now, you can basically step over it without really raising your feet that high. And one interesting way we're seeing this is now a group of vegans wants veganism recognized as a human right in Ontario. And you know what? It looks like they might just get it. The new human rights law in this province that I'm in has said that creed is a protected grounds. Creed, one's belief system, typically one's religion, the way one lives their life. For a vegan, it's not just about dietary preference. They believe there is a direct imperative, a moral imperative, and a moral duty that comes from their abstention from eating meat, from wearing products that come from animals, from eating products that animals created. And vegans, for that matter, are often activists as well. There's that old meme going around online a little while ago, you know, a vegan, a CrossFitter, and an atheist walk into a bar. You know that because they all told you within 5 minutes. Yeah, that seems to be the case. There are no quiet vegans. Most of them want to make sure that you know exactly that that's the way they eat, and power to them. They have free speech. But the new policy on preventing discrimination was released in December. And this is what it says, quote, creed may also include non-religious belief systems that, like religion, substantially influence a person's identity, worldview, and way of life, unquote. So it doesn't refer to veganism, but a group called Animal Justice is now seizing this as being good news, saying, you know what, this is actually something that should be a protected human right. And what does it mean to be a protected human right? It doesn't mean you have the right to be a vegan. That's already a right that people in this country have. It means you have a right to use your veganism as a justification to fight against discrimination. Discrimination being anyone, for example, telling you have to be around leather, you have to be around meat, even if it is your job to do so. There is precedent under human rights law that the duties of your job can be considered discriminatory, even if your belief systems have changed. So even though veganism isn't cited here, don't be surprised. We've seen crazier things already. The founder of this group, Nick Wright, the founder of Animal Justice, has said that this change is important for ethical vegans. He said because where accommodation is required, businesses, employers will have a legal right to enforce it. Now, the Human Rights Commissioner, the new one, Barbara Hall had the job before, now it's Renew Mandane, has said that they're open to it, but ultimately the Human Rights Tribunal is the body that gets to decide what is in fact considered part of creed. But one of the big concerns here is that if you worked at a workplace, for example, where you had a uniform that had a leather belt, vegans could say, I can't wear that, that is discrimination. Or if there was a work event at a steakhouse, Animal Justice believes that this would be required to have the event moved or canceled. And one of the spokespeople for this group has said it's a big step forward for human rights in Ontario. A step forward? No. It's a step of consistency. I have two big problems here. Number one, I think most of these so-called anti-discrimination laws are a load of bunk anyway. They violate business owners' right to basically practice their business the way they want to. But also, they inevitably stack groups up against each other. Someone from B'nai B'rith wrote an email to the Toronto Star about this and said, look, the Human Rights Commission and the Human Rights Code were put in place to combat real persecution based on cultural, ethnic, or religious affiliation. She said, should the interpretation of what constitutes creed be broadened to the point where any meaningful protection becomes difficult, it would weaken the effectiveness of existing legislative protections. But I'd argue they've already been weakened. How can the same body that says, ostensibly, that it supports religious freedom and sexual orientation freedom say that it's doing its job when it has to pit those two against each other? It compromises religious freedom to protect people's sexual orientation freedom. It imposes values by saying that there are right and wrong values to be held rather than embracing the idea of individual liberty and freedom itself. So the body is already inefficient and ineffective and sets a very dangerous path towards a curbing of freedom in this country. And then we look at the fact that it is used regularly and with a great deal of precedent to not only jeopardize the autonomy of a business owner or an employer, for example, but more importantly, to jeopardize, in some cases, public health and safety. One really big example of this, and this is going back to, I think, 2008, if I'm not mistaken. An employee in British Columbia of a McDonald's on Marine Drive won the right to not wash her hands at work. She is a food service employee. She won the right because she had a so-called skin condition that meant she couldn't wash her hands with soap. This was not just McDonald's corporate policy. This was actually law, part of the Health Act and the food premises regulations, and the Center for Disease Control, and the Food Protection Guidelines. And McDonald's, like any other corporate food service employer, has a lot of rules. They have signs saying wash your hands after you go to the washroom. They have a rule that says if you shake someone's hand, you have to wash your hands. If you get food from the freezer, you have to wash your hands. If you touch a door handle, you have to wash your hands. Apparently, they have a chime that goes off every hour at some locations, which basically reminds people, hey, wash your hands just in case. This one woman, a 23-year-old employee at the time, would not do it. She said she couldn't. McDonald's had to pay her for lost income. They had to pay her $25,000 for dignity and self-respect. McDonald's had to pay this But more importantly, it set a precedent that if you say you can't wash hands, then you probably shouldn't work in the food services industry. If your skin condition is real, it's not discriminatory to say, hey, you shouldn't be able to help other people. Now, I don't know what this person does. I don't know. Maybe they have some spiritual ritual after going to the washroom. They clap 3 hands and that's it. But either way, I don't want you handling my food, regardless of where you work. So again, the Human Rights Commission, because they're all the same from province to province, has basically said that one's right to feel included is more important than everyone else's right to healthy food, as an example. Well, maybe not healthy, but clean food at least. And then we can look at Rebel Commander Ezra Levant, who has spent more time sitting through this bureaucratic nonsense than most other Canadians, and power to him for doing it. He was actually charged with being, quote, publicly discourteous or disrespectful to a commissioner or tribunal chair of the Alberta Human Rights Commission because of a newspaper editorial he wrote calling the whole body crazy. Well, they really proved him wrong. And then we have Mark Stein and Maclean's in Quebec. The list goes on and on and on, from the absurd to the downright scary. Compromising freedom of speech for what? The feelings of bureaucrats, the feelings of the administrators of this kangaroo court? And it happens in every province. There was a big one in Ontario as well several years ago, where a biological male went to the Human Rights Commission because this person, who was a post-op transgender transsexual female, wanted to get plastic surgery to improve the labia, the appearance of it. It was cosmetic surgery. They went to a doctor, did not tell the doctor until the day of the consultation that the person was actually born a male. The surgeon said, look, I can't do that. This is a different technique that's required because of your body. I'm not able to do it. Ended the appointment. The person ended up going to the Human Rights Commission demanding tens of thousands of dollars because they felt offended, because it was discriminatory. These are not real human rights. Human rights are things like freedom, things that are innate, not granted by government. When government goes through with this bingo card of human rights that apparently are offered, all it does is compromise other rights that people actually have that are a heck of a lot more important to maintain. So we look at veganism. Do you have a human right to be a vegan? Absolutely. You have a human right to eat whatever you want. Or to not eat whatever you want, to wear what you want, to not wear whatever you want. But if you apply for a job where those rights are not going to be met with much accommodation, or where there's no interest in accommodating or no ability to accommodate you, well, tough luck. Get another job. If the uniform is a leather belt and your employer doesn't want you to wear some synthetic belt, then I guess you have to work somewhere else. If you work for a place where they have their events at a steakhouse, well, I'm sorry to say, I'm not foregoing my right to have steak with my coworkers just because you would rather eat kale and quinoa. Not that there's anything wrong with it. And I would go one step further and say we don't need to have any anti-discrimination protections in the private sector. Let contract law and public opinion do the work here. That seems to me like a much more suitable option to deal with this. But at the same time, I also wonder, where do we go from here? I'm actually astonished we haven't actually seen protections of veganism just yet. I mean, what if someone says, you know what, my dietary creed, my lifestyle, the way I eat, I am a meat eater only. I'm a carnivore only. No salads, no vegetables, nothing, just meat. Is that a human right? If you're a hunter, is that a human right? Let's not forget that vegan activists, animal rights activists, are often the people who are actually doing more of a disservice to animals than anything else in their advocacy, in their quest. Like we had that one woman, a PETA protester, who gave water to a pig in a truck, being hauled off. And this was a really interesting one. This was back in November of last year. She was facing, or is facing, 10 years in jail. And there was actually a pig farmer who responded to this story saying, you know what, when someone who you don't know is giving a liquid that you don't know about to your pigs, that risks a lot. It risks a lot. And he said, you know what? They're not humans. They are looked after. But ultimately, he doesn't know what's in there. So yeah, no wonder there was a police complaint. And she was doing this because in her eyes, she's a crusader. If she doesn't save the pigs, no one else will. It's nothing to do with dietary. It is a religion. So should they be given human rights protections under human rights law? I would say yes, only because the Human Rights Commission has to be consistent. But the answer is not by saying, well, you know what, vegans shouldn't have these human rights protections. The answer is by saying, what are we really gaining as a society by having these kangaroo commissions and tribunals that are able to make up rights and unevenly enforce rights? One of my personal favorites, the right to be at a comedy show and not be offended. Did you hear about this one from a while ago? A comedian from Toronto, Guy Earl, was in Vancouver, heckled, or I guess made jokes at someone who was heckling, who happened to be a lesbian. This took place back in 2007. The case ended up being settled in 2011, and the lesbian won $22,500 because a comedian hurt her feelings. Look, I was at a comedy show 2 weekends ago. I was sitting in a place where if they wanted to absolutely tear me to shreds, they would have had that ability to. And you know what? It's a comedy show. You are asking for it the second you walk through those doors. But she and her partner heckled the comedian along with other comedians. Apparently, they even threw drinks in his face, 2 of them specifically. But no, the Human Rights Tribunal, also BC, of course, sided with her and said that Guy Earl must pay her $15,000. The owner of the restaurant was ordered to pay $7,500 because, well, you know what, he should have prevented it. The tribunal ruled that discrimination was not justified. And I would say that it wasn't even discrimination. It's a comedy show. If you don't like it, you get up and leave. What about him? Why is it a comedian a protected class? Why can't he be funded by them for their discrimination against his right as a comedian to express himself freely and to earn a living at a show that he's getting paid for, that he's working for? Why is that not acceptable? Why is that not allowed? And the list goes on and on. I know Kathy Shadle has written about this incredibly well. She had a book, The Tyranny of Nice, which goes through a lot of these cases. But the problem is the list keeps growing. The list keeps getting larger and larger to such a point where I don't know how anyone can actually have the one-size-fits-all rule book of how these commissions work, because they honestly make these up as they go along. And we're expected to just sit back and live with it. Apparently, since you can't even criticize them without being charged by the commissions in and of itself. And it's this culture where everyone has to feel good, everyone has to be happy, everyone needs to be comfortable. And that's why the title of Shadle's book, The Tyranny of Nice, is so apt. Because niceness has become absolutely tyrannical. And it's not just with human rights commissions, it happens in culture as well. You know, I actually had to share with you this one story which was absolutely baffling. Well, not baffling, actually. That's why it's so frustrating. It's unsurprising, but still concerning, of a school in the U.S. It's a St. Paul, Minnesota public school in a neighborhood that has apparently a lot of diversity. Apparently, Bruce Vento Elementary School has 63% Asian American, 24% are African American, 10% are Hispanics, and only 4% are Caucasians. So the principal sent a letter to parents at the end of January saying that the school is not going to be celebrating Valentine's Day, which is coming up in just about 9 days, I think. Just about 9 days, Valentine's Day not happening at the school. But moreover, neither is Thanksgiving, Christmas, or even Halloween, because these are apparently not inclusive. This was what he said in the letter. The intent is to create a school climate that is welcoming and respectful of all cultures. A board policy says the only observances schools should actually celebrate are Martin Luther King Jr. Day, President's Day, and Veterans Day. Now, so far, this is an outlier in the region. But at the same time, I also don't understand how this ends up flying by. Because what they're actually saying is that there's a right and a wrong way to be an Asian American, to be an African American, to be a Hispanic. They're saying that of all of those, they can't be Christians to celebrate Christmas. They can't be in love to celebrate Valentine's Day. They can't be grateful to celebrate Thanksgiving. They can't like candy to celebrate Halloween. Of the accepted days, Martin Luther King Jr. Day, President's Day, and Veterans Day, well, what about Quakers? They can't fight in the war. Isn't it offensive to celebrate Veterans Day around them? And the Star Tribune looked at some of these in the U.S., and they said that in St. Paul, there is actually a discretion afforded to teachers about Valentine's Day. In another area, there's another school that has a no-holiday policy. It's called the Wayzata School District. Valentine's Day is the only holiday they're actually allowed to celebrate. So who benefits from this? Who wins from this? Even with Christmas, which is one of the most religiously centered holidays apart from Easter, I've heard nothing but the shrugging of shoulders from people that don't observe Christmas when schools celebrate it. People saying, well, I don't care. I get the day off and I don't have to celebrate Christmas. That's fine. Jews, Muslims, atheists, doesn't matter. They'll take the day off. They don't really care that much. So I don't know who benefits from this. It's the white, politically correct, secular liberals who are so terrified of having any such celebrations. And we've really seen this take form piecemeal in other areas. We've had, as David the Menzoid Menzies on the Rebel has talked about, Green Day as an alternative to St. Patrick's Day because, well, that word saint is so offensive. We've had other things as well, like Halloween being converted to Black and Orange Day across Canada. We've had, Christmas pageants being called holiday plays to outright being canceled. But this blanket no holiday policy is something that, to me, is a bit new. At least they're being consistent. But I have to wonder if a student wants to, observe Ramadan or Hanukkah or Kwanzaa, if they will be equally denied the right to do so at school because of these public school policies. And I also wonder where we go from here, where the line is drawn. What else are we going to eradicate? Why not history? Heck, some cultures don't come out well if you look through history. So are we going to change the curriculum now just because we want to be more inclusive and welcoming? If a group of students, let's say this place does have a majority of minority students, if they want to get together and celebrate something from their own country, their own background, their own culture, I think that's fine. I would say let's celebrate all, but let's also recognize that Christmas is celebrated by the majority of people in North America. Valentine's Day celebrated by even more, because even though obviously St. Valentine is the force behind it, it is, if anything, a completely secular holiday. Even more so than Christmas has become, because I'm pretty sure most people couldn't even tell you that there was supposed to be a religious undertone to Valentine's Day. And Halloween, what's the wrong with Halloween? Thanksgiving, what's wrong with? Well, I guess that's apparently something that brings up some bad memories for Native Americans. Who knows? We need to fight back. It used to be where to be a rebel, you needed to march, to protest. You needed to fight, to hold signs, to picket, to rally. To be a rebel today, now all you need to do is say Merry Christmas. Because this is apparently something that has been elevated to the status of controversy. These are the types of decisions that are permeated by those human rights commissions that we were talking about just a few moments ago. These are why that diversity industry exists. And this is why the rebel needs to exist. We've got to take a break here. When we come back in just a couple of moments, we will have more Lawton Online here on the Rebel.media. I'm Andrew Lawton. We'll be right back.
Irreverent, intelligent, and indefatigable. You're tuned in to Lawton Online with Andrew Lawton.
We are back. This is Lawton Online on the rebel.media. I know on last week's show, I spent a fair bit of the program talking about the refugee issue, talking about what's going on in Europe and also to a lesser extent, but still in a very real way, in Canada. And I spoke about this from an immigration perspective, from a security perspective, from a refugee perspective, from even a socio-cultural religious perspective. What I didn't talk about is the moral imperative that I think lies on people in this country. When we see sexual assaults, rapes, etc. going on at the hands of refugees and other migrants, well, who can stop this? It's one thing to say, okay, don't let refugees in the country or do your security screenings, etc. But we also have to look at where that onus of protection really lies for a society. And I was certainly inspired by a monologue that my Rebel colleague and friend Faith Goldy had in her show last Thursday. Now, I should also say I was a guest on that program, so that should certainly motivate you to tune in as well. I should hope. I'm going to play a little bit of that monologue for you right now.
Hi, Europe? Yeah, just one question for you. Where are all your dudes? I'm just wondering, because it would seem like there are no men left over there. Like, where were all the guys on New Year's Eve in Cologne or Berlin or Hamburg? And where are all the men in Sweden, like every day while chicks are getting raped? I looked in Amsterdam, but all I could find there were these sissies in skirts pretending violent sex attackers actually give a damn about their protest. Oh, and I checked in with Sweden. All I found there was this police chief who sympathizes with a migrant murderer. Then I looked in Norway, and they're pretty sure that their anti-rape courses for migrants will be enough to keep the whole need for men thing at bay. And I checked in with Denmark, but they're a little busy prosecuting a woman who pepper sprayed a rapist, yet to return my calls.
That was Faith Goldy, fellow Rebel, host of On the Hunt, and all-around wonderful, wonderful person. Faith, great to have you on the podcast. Thank you very much, and well said in that monologue there.
Thanks very much for having me, Andrew.
So you later described that phenomenon that you were laying out as a testosterone recession, a word that, or a term rather, that I still chuckle over, except I also weep over it because I know how true it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the best way to describe where we are right now, frankly. And I think it's really been a byproduct of the third wave feminist movement. What I mean by that is after women kind of did their work in garnering the vote, getting equal pay in the workplace, achieving essentially all of the objectives of the women's lib movement, rather than patting themselves on the back and saying, well, ladies, job well done, time for us to move on. What they instead did, or at least a fraction of them, was begin to manufacture crises and kind of sore spots that they'd choose to be offended at. And in doing so, what they did was, in my opinion at the very least, create a culture within which men and even many women, myself included, up until, I just stopped giving a damn, became afraid to say what they thought or what they truly believed, and fear of being called a sexist or a bigot or what have you. And what's happened is that chip by chip, we have slowly really eaten away at the male psyche, male intuitions, and frankly, we have successfully, I would say to a large degree, rid society of masculinity.
It's a term that I've heard other people characterize as the pussification of the West, of America, of Canada, of North America.
I didn't know about that, by the way, but it wasn't until I sent this video that the amount of hashtag pussification, it's now a thing.
Yeah, and you know what? People would obviously say, oh, well, that's sexist that you use that word, but ultimately, you can call it whatever you want. The fact of the matter is it's happening. Men no longer feel like they can be men, and you have some people like yourself that say, I just don't give a damn, and are going to do it anyway. But I wanted to ask you, first off, when we look at the backdrop of the migrant sex attacks and other things going on, why is it important that men must be men? Because I want to really lay out for people why this is such a detriment to Canada and to Western culture in general that men are in this place.
Right, because it is up to men right now to reclaim the balance in society. What's happened is by allowing feminists to dominate, these third-wave feminists to dominate the microphone, what's happened is that we have essentially bought into a massive hypocritical lie. One that says, rape culture is a drunk man having sex with a woman, but if a drunk woman has sex with a man, it's a rape victim. Rape culture is this, that, and the other thing. Meanwhile, they're importing in droves over 1 million in just Germany alone of men who come from cultures where rape culture is a real thing. And so no longer are we in fictitious battlefields where enemy is some sort of ethereal shadow that has been painted by these lying third-wave feminists, but in fact, the enemy is a real rapist, is a real sexist, is a real bigot, and one who doesn't give a damn about your woman's lack of will to have sex with him, to possibly be, as it's sometimes put, digitally penetrated when she's out just trying to celebrate her New Year's. And frankly, as the weaker sex, and I have no problem saying that, someone who works out, who's 6 feet tall outside of heels, who also is proficient in firearms, but as the weaker sex, I can't fight this battle alone. I need my brothers beside me, and we as a society need to reclaim that balance, because a society without a masculine trait has been proven to be a failed experiment entirely.
It's funny. I mean, you're talking about this in terms of protection and self-preservation and very, very real and very serious threats that do exist in the world. We've seen it happen on a level of the more trivial and mundane things really being targeted as well. And one example of this is chivalry, which in a lot of cases we've seen, some of these, as you've mentioned, third-wave feminists really say, chivalry is sexist, chivalry is misogynistic. People that honestly think that common courtesy, a man holding a door for a woman, is part of the problem. And what I think is important to stress is that if we can't get people to accept that these things are not bad, how are we ever going to get these feminists to accept that men playing the role of protector is actually a good thing?
Right. In no way do I think either of us seek to say that, not holding a door open is, leading to real rape culture in Europe. That's not the situation here whatsoever. But, and I'm paraphrasing here, you're the Protestant, so you're better at Bibling than myself. I'm the Catholic, we just kind of post to the Pope and say that it problem solved. It's habits form character, and character forms a man. It's not like all of a sudden you're going to go from that guy who doesn't hold the door open out of fear of being lambasted by a feminist to all of a sudden protecting her when some refugee is trying to stick his hands down her pants. Okay, no, these are learned characteristics, something that needs to be habitualized within the male psyche. And unfortunately, from a very, very young age, we shut those switches off in young men. Andrew, my sister, just gave birth to a boy in November. And her husband and her are both very traditional. One of the things that they seek to do is to raise a man in the traditional sense of the word. Someone who will look to women as not some weak, inferior thing to be infantilized, but as worthy of protection, of worthy of care, and frankly, to put women up on a pedestal where women always have been. They are the crown of all of God's creation, right? After the earth, the sun, the moon, the stars, men came women. We are the crown of the creation. Okay, there's an argument made there about Sabbath, but anyway, and that is how men should look at women. And it's nothing for we women to say, stop doing it. We don't want that. Instead, we should say, thank you very much for actually truly honoring us and investing in us the worth that we inherently have.
But I wanted to go back to a point you just made in that answer there, which is looking at where someone admitting that, okay, men can be protectors, men can look out for women, where that line is drawn between that and infantilizing, because a lot of feminists do think that the two are one and the same. You're saying that, look, there is a difference. Yes, infantilizing and looking down on someone is wrong, but being a protector doesn't mean you're doing that.
Right. Now, when I say infantilizing, I mean, me wanting to make conversation at a dinner party and, oh, now, darling, don't bother your small little brain with those sorts of big ideas. That's the sort of stuff I mean. But if I'm being attacked on the streets, hell, I don't care if you need to think of me as a child, a dog, or whatever the hell, just come out and help me. And there are lines, right? And I think that what we've allowed the third wave feminist narrative to do is to blur those lines and to say any form of protection that a man seeks to offer a woman is inherently and always a form of infantilization, right? And we have to look at the fruits of these feminists to see what they're actually about, because what we've done is that we've allowed ourselves to be pressured into buying into their narratives when, I mean, I'm sure you've been following this Rush V guy, right? He's basically, a pickup artist. I frankly wouldn't care about his work whatsoever, except for the fact that he's now become public enemy number one for feminists. So here we are in the wake of, really since New Year's Eve, this rape culture, imported rape culture in Europe.
Not even rape culture, actual rape here. I mean, rape culture is a lot more mythical than what's going on in Europe.
Absolutely. So rapes, sexual assaults on all over the spectrum. It's totally spiked, and now the media is forced to report, and authorities are being forced to react to it, although largely inappropriately or ineffectively. So what do the feminists do about the rapes occurring in Europe? La da 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 da, play some Jeopardy music. Rush V makes a joke about rape on a blog, and they're all screaming their heads off, right? So I think we as a society need to step back and just say, okay, whoa, we're taking tips from these people who are offended by a video or a sentence or a blog post, but can't figure out what to say, how to formulate some sort of a statement for where they are right now as a movement about actual rapes happening to real women in Europe, with no sign of slowing down. The doors are still open, right? The authorities and police say that it's, quote, too politically awkward to say that it's the Muslims that are doing this, the Muslim refugees. The mayors are saying, you know what, woman, you got to stand 1 foot back away from these strange men. What? Myself, someone who went to an all-girls school for 14 years, you want to tell me that I got to stay 1 foot away from every single man out there that I don't know in order not to be raped? Up yours, buddy. That ain't Western society. That's not the society. I live in a free society where, yeah, I can wear a mini skirt. I don't need to go on a slut walk, thank you, Rich. I can wear a mini skirt. Sure, I'll get all those. Sure, I'll get eyes. But to have someone reach his hands down my pants ain't my fault. That's his fault. He's the pig. And frankly, you want to know what real racism is? Real racism is painting 1.6 billion Muslims, 1 million of which are now being imported into Germany alone, with one fell swoop, the same paintbrush. All of them, we are saying, are not able to be held to the same standards as Western civilized nations. They can be nothing more than barbaric in their pursuit of sexual entertainment. That's the message we send. Look at these poor savages. It's how they know. It's how they operate. So we have to change them. No, because it is savage. It is barbaric. You want to get to know a girl? You want to get your hands down her pants? There's proper procedure in this country, okay?
You mentioned a couple of moments ago the Rush comparison, and I think this is a really valid one because it's that level of relativism that seems to be apparent there. And I remember before Rush was coming back to Canada, we were looking at this Cologne, Germany thing, which, as you've noted, took days and days before people really warmed up to the idea that, hey, this happened. And then finally, everyone was forced to respond and report on it. But even in response of that, a lot of feminists were very concerned. They didn't want to say that Muslim immigrants were the problem. They wanted to say that men were the problem. Because, again, even the feminists are scared of trudging across that boundary of criticizing parts of Islam. But I find it interesting that even when you're faced with a cultural divide, you have these third-wave feminists, of which you've been speaking in this interview and in your show last week, who are still saying, no, all men are the problem.
Yeah, that's hogwash. What do you want me to say? I don't know, Andrew. How can you portray yourself as someone who is about nuance and, about all that, and at the same time paint all people of one category with the same brush? It's totally backwards.
I wanted to ask about that Rush situation just for a moment here, because you pointed out that, yeah, there is obviously a bit of a problem here when we have people getting more outraged out of, what a guy says on his blog than anywhere else. We've had, in the past few days, mayors in Canada's biggest cities like John Tory and Naheed Nenshi, et cetera, share their outrage on Twitter, and it's really meaningless because they can't do anything to ban someone from a city. They just want to get in the paper saying, they were against it. And I've read both sides of the Rush thing. I know Ezra Levant did an interview with him when he was coming to Toronto last time, and this time it's looking like he's backing off from his events. I'm one of these people where I look at it and I assume, okay, there's no way this guy's actually advocating for rape. I think bad satire is his crime, not sexual assault. And I'm looking at other people that are clinging to him as being, the portrait of everything that's wrong with anyone. But the problem is when I see so many people, men and women, condemning him, whether rightfully or wrongfully, I think that reinforces that he's not representative of the majority anyway.
Yeah, I'd agree with you 1,000%. I mean, you have to be a slightly brain dead to not tune into the fact that this guy's obviously not advocating for rape. But this is the thing, right, is that this social disease of, frankly, I mean, what is the root of, or maybe not the root, but at least the manifestation of so many instances of feminism, of this multiculturalism narrative, it always becomes manifested as political correctness. And one of the byproducts of that manifestation is an inability to take a joke. And I think as a society, we've lost our sense of humor. While, again, Ruch's sense of humor, it's not for me. I don't think people who are over-the-top profane are particularly funny. I think that there's a clever way to make a joke or to make a statement. And, I like things like subtlety and argument. Not that you could tell from the way I usually present my stuff. Yeah, and honestly, it's like the hashtag white people problems and first world problems, like that is what Ruch B is. Ruch B is a white person problem. He is a first world problem, right? But the sad part is that across Europe, the first world is largely a white people, continent and various parts of it being islands. We have real problems now. And the movement when it comes to feminism, which is, I think, in many ways, it has its epicenter in North America, just because there are so many outlets which give these people airtime. We haven't caught on yet. But, Andrew, I will tell you, we're about to get a rude awakening. We, thank God, are not going to have as huge of a percentage of our population, say, as Sweden, which now, by the way, as a percentage of the population, is taken in the most amount of refugees. They're also now the rape capital of Europe. And when you look at the percentages of other nations, accordingly, their rape populations are basically in step. We in North America are about to get a rude awakening. We are bringing in some 25,000 refugees here by March 1, for sure, that we know about. We don't know beyond that, maybe 35,000, maybe 50,000. The U.S. Senate is looking to see what the hell we're doing and how we're doing it. Apparently, we're fast-tracking, and, we might be missing a few steps, especially compared to our U.S. allies and neighbors, who, by the way, we have a largely unpoliced border with. These people coming here, I've been to the hotels. I've been to at least 2 hotels in the GTA. A lot of really bored-looking men. And they got to find ways to entertain themselves. There are no jobs for them right now. They don't even have houses over their heads. And when you have stuff like ISIS actually putting out statements saying how they are sending covert gunmen as refugees to the Western world, it is insane. It is naive for us to think that, 25, 35, or 50,000 people that are going to come into this nation, especially in the expedited way that we are bringing them in, are all going to be spotless. It is insane. All it will take is one case in Toronto, in Halifax, in Vancouver, anywhere where they are now shipping these people, I think, for the Canadian element of the third wave feminist movement to get a wake-up call. And I will really regret these words if, God forbid, that does happen and they still don't get a wake-up call. Pam Gellert, she said, you can ignore reality, but you can't ignore what comes from ignoring reality, which is to say you only get so many shots, and then you basically shot yourself in the foot. And if you look at the case study of Germany, you're seeing that. You look at Sweden, you're seeing that. Norway, Belgium, Denmark, you're seeing that all across. I don't know how many petri dishes we need to see come to a boil before we, as a North American continent, can get the feminist brick out of our butts and, frankly, reattach the marbles where they belong, to my male compatriots out there, and start proceeding business as usual. Let's get back to some balance in this country.
How far away do you think Canada is from Europe?
I'd say about a decade, honestly. If
current trends continue, that is.
Yeah, correct. I'd say, and that's being generous. I'd say we're about a decade behind.
So half a generation that we're looking at to see what we're seeing right now, thousands of kilometers away. And what's most concerning is that I don't even think there's enough of a chorus from the mainstream in Canada to want to fight that. I mean, look at what happened with Mark Stein in the past decade, railing against other things that were coming culturally. And we've already seen those manifest, and people didn't slow it down.
There have been Mark Stein, Nigel Farage, a lot of good people who have been kind of these modern day prophets, so to speak, who have said, look, A plus B equals C. A plus B equals C. And everyone's just there like, boo, no, it's bad. Like, no, guys. I mean, when you bring in tens of thousands in our case, or millions in Europe's case, of people from a war-torn nation, or several nations in Europe's case, where women, gays, lesbians, they're all treated totally, fundamentally differently than how we look at them here. I mean, I hope folks tune into my Rebel episode this week, because, you know, I bring up the case of the non-niqab wearing lesbian Jew. We have those in this country. I think we've debated a few of the similar ones, actually, Andrew, in media. And they're not thrown off buildings. You know, they're not told to get behind a curtain. A woman, when she says that she's raped in this country, she doesn't need four men as witnesses to corroborate her statement, right? These are all things. I'll tell you what. From my vantage point, steady as she goes, we're screwed as a continent. But what I would love to see happen in the next 10 years instead, I would love to see a reform of Islam at least begin to take roots. You do see that a little bit with, guys like Majid Nawaz, Raheel Raza, Tariq Fatah in a different way, calling for that reform to say, guys, we've got these really messed up parts of the Quran that, unless we say, you know, we're not okay with, are totally fundamentally different than Western civilization's tenets. What they hold to be true. So reforming Islam is one thing that could help, I think, provide a more favorable and fruitful relationship in this culture of civilization. The other thing, and it's not a reformation so much as it is a movement, and I think that as important as the women's lib movement was once upon a time, there has to be a male movement. And I'm not going to name it because I don't think a woman should name it. I'm not going to come up with some sort of sexy moniker.
Yeah, don't take away the one decision we get to make on this.
Yeah, exactly. No, honey. but you know, I think that men need to regain their cojones. They need to say, look, ladies, we respect you, we love you, we care for you, we want to have a favorable outcome in this experiment called civilization. We've done a lot of good work in the past thousands of years. Let's not have it all undone, basically, since the time of the sexual revolution, right? Like, we're talking in less than a century, a lot of very, very good and hard-fought work. It risks being eclipsed by a tyrannical, theocratic, hyper-patriarchal culture that we are importing, while our politicians, our authorities, and a great deal of our male population waits as sitting ducks. And I will say that when we muzzle well-meaning, pluralist, liberty-minded individuals, Andrew, like yourself, what happens is that you get radicals that come in and they fill the void. And then what happens is that we have extremists on both sides in this clash of civilizations, and nobody wants that.
Incredibly well said. I'm joined by Faith Goldy, host of On the Hunt, and a wonderful columnist, TV host, radio guest host in Toronto. Faith, so great to talk to you as always. Thank you so much for your time today, and I will try to find my testicles and reapply them as you've directed all men to do.
God bless you, my friend. Take care.
I kept hoping for her to say, no, not you, Andrew. You're one of the good ones. But now I'm feeling around just to make sure. In any case, got to take a break here. When we come back, more Lawton Online here on the Rebel.media. I'm Andrew Lawton. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton, exclusively on the Rebel.media. Email your thoughts to Andrew at andrewlawton.ca or tweet Andrew using @AndrewLawton.
Welcome back. This is Lawton Online here on the Rebel.media. I wanted to spend a few moments here with a story that goes along very well, actually, with my conversation a few moments ago with Faith Goldy. And it's about trying to understand, let's use words Justin Trudeau would understand here, the root causes of terrorism, the root causes of anti-West attitudes existing and, in a lot of cases, prospering in the West. The attitudes that have contributed to mass rape in Cologne, Germany. The attitudes that have contributed to a support for jihad in the West. It doesn't represent the majority of Muslims, but it represents a large enough group that we need to ask the question of what do we do about it and how do we publicly acknowledge and get other agencies and institutions to publicly acknowledge that this is a problem. When we're discussing Islam, there's this PC catchphrase you need to put in. I know not all Muslims are radicals, but, and it's true, not all are, but some are. And that was actually a line that Barbara Kay used as a headline of a piece in the National Post she wrote. She said, most Muslims aren't jihadists, of course, but some of them are. And she cites a short film released by Raheel Raza. Raheel Raza, a woman who is absolutely wonderful. She is the president of Muslims Facing Tomorrow. She's released a short video, and it's about challenging extremism and promoting dialogue. That's the series. The film is called The Untold Story of Muslim Opinions and Demographics. And Raheel Raza, a Muslim herself, a Canadian, talks about the fact that we're not just dealing with a small number of bad eggs. We're dealing with, in that part of the world, a very big problem here. Barbara Kay wrote about this and some of the statistics, which will be a fair bit shocking for you, I can guarantee. And that's in the National Post. Barbara Kay joins me on the line now. Great to talk to you again, Barbara. Thanks for your time.
Oh, thanks for having me, Andrew.
You've really summarized a couple of fascinating and, I'll say admittedly, quite concerning details in your piece here. What was the motivation for it? Because I know some of the themes have come up in other topics you've covered, but this was really, I think, a good primer if someone has never really looked into the issue before, even.
Well, I get rather irritated when I hear prominent politicians like President Obama saying, who refused ever to use the word Islamic when he talked about terrorism for 8 years. It was only at the San Bernardino massacre that he uttered that word, where you get people like Hillary Clinton, who after a terrorist incident says, terrorism has nothing to do with Islam. And then you get people like Justin Trudeau, who has more, who gets very angry when there's an apparently anti-Muslim incident or, at a mosque, but has nothing to say about terrorism, Islamic terrorism in the world today. And the main motivation of these influential politicians seems to be, do not allow yourself to even go there in terms of associating terrorism with anything to do with the religion of Islam. We can't go there. We don't discuss it. It is Islamophobic to even discuss it. And this bothers me very much because when there is a belief system that is encouraging or is being used or alluded to by people who commit crimes and terror, and they say, well, I get my inspiration from my faith, I think we have to pay attention, and we have to say, well, should we be, we should know about attitudes and beliefs within our own countries. This is a matter of national security. This is not to say that we think all Muslims harbor, attitudes like this or wishes or support for terrorism, but wouldn't it be good? I mean, we're trying to fight radicalization. Wouldn't it be good to know? And there is research, and I thought, well, I'd like to know about it. And then I saw Raheel's video, and I thought, well, good for Raheel. Here is a Muslim who wants her faith to be the best that it can be, and she feels patronized when she has all these do-goody, political correct, like Ben Affleck, who says it's hate speech to even talk about, anti-Western activity as having any kind of relationship to this faith system.
And what you note in your column here, which is especially concerning, is that Raheel Raza has been subject to fatwas, to death threats for daring to call out that there are some people in her religion who, threaten death and issue fatwas.
Yes, all the time. She, for years, she jokes about it every time she gives a little speech. She says, I'm the number one target for fatwas in Canada. And she sort of sloughs it off, but I fear for her. I think it's, very brave of her to say Islam could use a reform period and some self-interrogation. And we have to move with the times and all that. She loves her religion, and I think she is the one that truly loves it, because the people who say you can't talk about this, I don't think that's true love. I think that's a kind of blindness, a willed blindness, because all faith systems have their weak spots where, certain elements can be translated into a kind of enthusiasm to go further than they should in promoting it. So good for Raheel. She's a real. So I called her a national treasure, and she is.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the numbers here, because it's become this qualifying statement you have to make every time you talk about this issue. I know that these don't represent the majority, and it's almost, tired that we have to do this just because of political correctness. Obviously, no one forces us to. It is true, though, but we're dealing with a very large religion, 1.6 billion adherents in the world, and I wanted to talk about some of the stats, because even if you're dealing with a small percentage of 1.6 billion can still be a lot that hold very radical ideas.
Absolutely, and that is the problem. I mean, you talk about, say, how many people in the United States where there are 3 million Muslims. Well, how many people are supportive of jihadism? Well, when you find that there are, it's only 10%. Well, that's 300,000 people. 300,000 people don't condemn terrorism. That's not good, because within those 300,000 people, there may be, space for radicalization where it's not reported and where it's even encouraged.
And it takes like one to carry out a terrorist attack.
Exactly.
And
so, and then, of course, when you look at the countries that from which we're drawing many of our immigrants, the statistics are quite disconcerting. You've got 345 million Muslims who believe that the honor killings of girls and women are sometimes or always justified. You've got 281 million Muslims who think that cutting off the hands of thieves and stoning, female adulterers and homosexuals is okay. I mean, these are punishments that are written in Sharia law. Other religions also had, in the Torah, you also had stonings for adultery. I mean, all religions start out in a way with very harsh, this was hundreds or thousands of years ago, but the other religions have gone through periods of reform, or they have bodies of law around, like the Torah has the halacha, which is the fence around the law, and they drop the harsh punishments because they say, well, this does not go along with a modern, set of principles, and we'll just quietly set those aside. We're not going to do that anymore. But Sharia law has not been reformed, and in countries where it's strictly operative, like Saudi Arabia and all, you have huge numbers of people, millions and millions and millions of people who say, yeah, well, it's good. This is the punishment that should happen to gay people. This is the punishment that should happen to women who are not chaste. You have we're not getting people from Saudi Arabia coming here, but we are getting from other countries, Pakistan and other countries where there's a lot of this attitude that the law has to be obeyed.
Very well said. The film we're talking about, The Untold Story of Muslim Opinions and Demographics, available at clarionproject.org. Barbara Kay, National Post columnist, joins me on the line. The piece is a must-read. Most Muslims aren't jihadists, of course, but some of them are. Barbara, always a pleasure. Really appreciate your time today.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. Glad to be with you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Barbara. I've got to wrap things up in just a moment here, but I want to mention a couple of very final points here. I mentioned at the top of the segment that politically correct catchphrase we all must employ, that we know not all Muslims are radicals, and it's so true, which is why I think it's so paramount and so important that the sensible, radical Muslims, the so-called peaceful majority we hear all about, speak out against it. And that's why it astonishes me. I mean, it doesn't, but it should astonish most people. Why people like Raheel Raza, Salim Mansur are absolutely vilified by a lot of Muslim organizations. Women and men that speak out about the problems in their own faith, vilified. I had a Muslim ask me once, well, do Christians have to speak out and condemn Westboro Baptist Church? I say, absolutely they do. They have to say, that is not us, that is not Christianity, that is not what a love of Christ looks like. The same reason blacks have to speak out against the Black Panthers. Germans had to speak out against Nazis. Jews have to speak out against Lev Tahor. It may not be nice that we have to be accountable for the worst within our group, but it is a moral imperative if you value your identity, your group, your culture, religion, race, etc., to speak out against those who are maligning that, if you want people to take you seriously and believe that you are, as we're so often told, we must accept a voice for peace. So I say quite effectively to that, your move, Muslims. We've got to wrap things up for the show today. When we come back next week, we will have lots more with a brand spanking new episode of Lawton Online. I'm Andrew Lawton. This is the Rebel.media. We'll talk to you soon, Canada. God bless you.
Thanks for tuning in to Lawton Online. Check out the Rebel.media for lots more fearless content and commentary.